So today we're talking about the original version of Canon's EF 24-105mm f4L lenses, and basically this was the first higher end option for a full frame DSLR kit lens. Range on this lens is obviously really great, going from 24mm wide angle into telephoto at 105mm, which means this is potentially a really great option for even hybrid shooters because it also has optical image stabilization built into the lens. So this lens is for the EF mount, which means that it's also going to be able to adapt seamlessly to Canon's current full frame mirrorless RF mount cameras. And I've been shooting with this lens for the past few weeks, and it's actually the second time that I've been able to shoot with this lens. So I'm gonna give you my thoughts and insights as far as should you save a few $100s or potentially $1,000 and stick with this older lens, or does this older design not really keep up with modern lenses? So as far as build quality goes with this lens, it is an old school DSLR L lens from Canon, which means that the construction is primarily metal. It has weather sealing. It's definitely a premium feel to it as far as the construction, but the styling is also pretty outdated on this lens. So originally the lens did come with the lens hood included, but this lens has been out of production for quite a while, so you're gonna be buying it used, and most of the used options I've seen, they tend to not still have the lens hood with it. But as far as the lens itself, it does have obviously the zoom ring. It has a manual focus ring, and this is a physical focus. It's not a focus by wire like the current RF lenses, and you can see the focus distance on the lens. It also has, of course, a autofocus manual focus selection switch, and it has an image stabilization on off switch. There is no zoom lock on this lens, and again, these are older lenses. In my experience, you do tend to have some lens creep if you're hiking around with this lens or walking around with it on a camera strap, something like that. This lens weighs 1.48 pounds or 670 kilograms, and if you're using it on one of the mirrorless RF cameras with the adapter, it's going to be 1.78 pounds or about 785 grams. With the adapter, it's going to still be lighter than the RF 24-72.8, which is going to be 1.98 pounds, but it's slightly heavier than the RF 24-105 f4L lens, which comes in at 1.54 pounds. So when it comes to photography, again, 24-105 is a really versatile zoom range. So with a lens like this, it's going to basically be able to handle whatever situation you come across. Now, it's not going to be the perfect solution for all of those situations that you come across, but whatever you have to end up photographing, you can typically get it done with a lens like this. And that can be valuable because you can just take one camera and one lens rather than a heavy camera bag a lot of times. This lens does of course have the maximum aperture of f4, which is not bad, but that is half of the amount of light that you would get coming through a more expensive f2.8 zoom lens, and about a 16th the amount of light that you would get coming through like an f1.4 prime lens. But then that is going to have some cost and weight savings to only have a maximum aperture of f4 as well. And that's how we're able to get such a long zoom range in lenses like this. And keep in mind that if you're shooting this with one of the modern full frame cameras, they do really well with low light, and that's not going to be a problem having a maximum aperture of f4 anyway. So talking about image quality, and I did shoot with this mainly on my Canon R, which is a 30 megapixel sensor. And most of these photos are from when I took the camera and lens on a hike. And first of all, I am not a nature or landscape photographer at all. Don't claim to be, don't try to be. And also the lighting for most of this hike was pretty terrible, but that is definitely going to put the performance of this lens to the test anyway. So image quality wide open at f4 is not great. You don't have a ton of contrast. Color reproduction isn't great. It's decent. You can work with it in post and bring that back, but it will require more time and effort in processing and editing these photos. Now the image quality, if you stop the aperture down just a little bit, and most of these photos I shot at f5.6, and the colors and the contrast, they get quite a bit better really quickly, even at this point, and the images are looking much nicer. As far as vignette, I'm not super worried about that because that's literally a one-click fix in Lightroom. There is definitely different ranges and levels of distortion throughout the zoom range in this lens, but again, one-click fix for the most part in Lightroom, and I didn't see anything that I would consider image ruining from this. As far as sharpness goes, it's decent. It's not quite resolving the 30 megapixels of the R, but I don't think it's going to be an issue in most cases, and I think it would probably keep up with the slightly lower resolution sensors of like the RP and the R6. As far as the image stabilization goes, it was actually surprisingly good in photography, and at 105 millimeters, I was able to get even a few keepers that were decently sharp at 1/15th of a second. I couldn't really get any keepers below that, but at 105 millimeters, you are getting into the range where even in normal conditions, image stabilization could be helpful, and it'll definitely be helpful if you are a photographer that likes to shoot with slower shutter speeds. So the autofocus performance wasn't an issue, definitely didn't hold me back while I was shooting. Overall with this lens, it's not the best or most well-performing lens on the market at all, but when you think about the versatility and price point of this lens, the performance, I'd say, becomes interesting. So when it comes to video, again, this is a very versatile zoom range. You have a lot of focal lengths that are going to typically be used pretty often, the 24, the 35, the 50, the 85, and then all the way into the 105 millimeter at the long end of this lens. And of course, this does not have the fastest aperture, but a lot of times you're going to be filming at f4 or smaller apertures anyway, of course, depending on style. And with the modern, especially mirrorless cameras that we have on the market, the low light performance isn't going to be an issue here. Image quality here is good. It's not the best, especially wide open, but if you're able to stop it down to 5.6 even, the image quality does get better pretty quickly. It's not going to be the sharpest lens, but you don't always want the super sharpest look. A lot of people will put even filters on their photo lenses to kind of soften out the look anyway, because modern lenses can be a bit too sharp when you're filming people especially. And when you're filming, you don't really need to resolve as much through the lens anyway, because even if you're filming in 4K, that's only the equivalent of somewhere around 9 megapixels. As far as the optical image stabilization in the lens, it actually performed better than I thought it would, and it is still not as good as the optical image stabilization in the RF lenses, but for static handheld shots, it actually worked really well, and even for panning shots and shots where I was moving around, it still performed pretty decently. So for the price point, I think this is actually a solid, versatile option if you don't need a fast aperture and something where you can not shell out a ton of money, but have a lot of different focal lengths to work with. So who's it for? And I think first, if you are using this lens paired together with something like a used DSLR like the 5D Mark II, that makes a really good versatile option for a budget full frame photography kit. I would say though that you're going to want to be shooting with a lot and good lighting for something like that. For shooters with an APS-C camera, 24 millimeters on APS-C sensors is not going to be as wide, so you lose a lot of versatility. 105 millimeters is going to get you more reach. But if you are shooting with an APS-C camera, I would probably suggest looking at something more like the EFS 17-55 f2.8 lens. So for full frame mirrorless shooters, it does become an interesting question because there is also the RF 24-105 f4 to 7.1 STM lens, and that is $400. And I am not a fan of that lens, and I suggest avoiding it for most cases, but is again $400, and it does have some advantages, like it is sharper when shooting at f4, but with the RF STM lens, you can only shoot at f4 from 24 millimeters to something around like 28 millimeters, and then it quickly gets a maximum aperture that goes to 7.1 from there. But the RF STM lens does have better image stabilization. It's going to have a little bit faster autofocus, and at 0.87 pounds or 395 grams, it is also much smaller than this EF lens. And you can probably find this EF lens in certain cases for $400, but if you don't already have the RF adapter, that's another $100 that you have to add to the cost of this lens. And that makes this lens more expensive than the RF STM lens for a lens that isn't a clear winner in every category. But the EF lens does have a constant maximum aperture of f4 throughout the entire zoom range. It also has a dedicated autofocus manual focus switch, which the RF STM lens does not have. And because it's an EF mount lens, you can potentially use it with the ND filter adapter. I do think it could be a budget option for photographers who want a constant f4 maximum aperture, but on more of a budget. And I do think it's also an interesting thing to look at as an option for video shooters in certain types of shooting, like for instance, documentary, where you want to have a versatile zoom range. But anyway, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments below. Are you looking at this lens? Have you used this lens before? If so, what do you think about this lens? If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. If you're interested in buying this lens or any of the other gear that I've talked about in the video, I will have affiliate links in the description below. If you use these links to purchase the gear at no extra cost to you, you'll help support this channel so that I can keep making videos like this for you guys. Thanks, see ya.